pioneers and legends whose successes we've celebrated but haven't received their due like the ones in other cities have. This is the Boston Legends Podcast, hosted by me, Dart Adams. And this is the Boston Legends Podcast. This is a podcast where we highlight all the rebels, the legends, the change agents, and the luminaries that didn't get their proper shine or respect at the time like other regions' legends did, but we're going to shine the light on them here and now. So, okay, of course, I'm Dart Adams, but I'm here with another person who is well versed in all of these people, all these people, the movers and shakers that really shaped and formed what we know as Massachusetts and Boston basketball, especially. And that man is John Bain. Nice to finally have you here, sir.
Yes, yes. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No doubt. One of the things we always want to do is shine light on the history and give full context and perspective on what happened before we got to the era post 1972, where Boston and Massachusetts and New England, to a farther degree, actually had enough talent where people understood that we were a force within the world of basketball. But there was a time before that where that was also the case, and we have brought on Bajan to talk about it.
It's a good point because people talk about, and not everybody is going to be familiar with this term, but the Boston Six, and the first year of the shootout in '72 being sort of the cutoff point where Eastern Mass was on the recruiting max, specifically Rochester, Dorchester, Mattapan, JP. It isn't as if there were not very strong players coming out of Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury before then, but they weren't going to the type of high schools that might have been highlighted in the Globe and the Herald prior to that.
Yeah. And they were the people that did most of the publicity. So if you go back and look at archives and look at names, you're going to find them in the Globe or the Herald in their like listings of who the top schoolboys if you go search. So one of the things was there's this picture that I remember you sent me. And what's the significance of this picture?
Okay, this is a club called the Exquisites, and it's obviously a club of young men standing with a couple of their mentors, like Reverend Michael Haynes and a gentleman who was also a junior high school coach in Roxbury that coached some of these guys in middle school. And they're standing in Ted Kennedy's Senate office, apparently, on a visit to D.C., like a mini class trip. And the Exquisites was a group of brothers from Roxbury who could all really ball. Most of them were basketball. There might have been some track and field sprinkled in there. Chuck Shelton, Leo Osgood, Harry Barnes, who ended up playing at Northeastern in the late 60s. Peter Parham, Leroy Wilson, guys like that, who all knew each other from hoops and were formed as a sort of social club to help steer young men on the right path in Roxbury.
All right. So when we talk about Boston and Massachusetts basketball, again, it always comes up to 1972. Why? Because that's the year the Roxbury Basketball Association is formed. That's the year the Boston Shootout starts. That's the year the MIAA is formed. But previous to that, there was an explosion of Boston basketball and Massachusetts basketball to the point where, out of the ashes of the old Boston Tech League, we have the BNBL. So can we talk about the 60s in particular in Boston basketball?
Okay, what happens in the 60s is you have these kids who are the sons and daughters of either Southern immigrants from the 30s and 40s, and lesser degree 50s, or the daughters and sons of West Indian immigrants from the 30s and 40s. So the city becomes a little bit more black, maybe 15 to 22%, depending on what year we're talking about, 60s, 70s, 80s. All those kids are in the high schools. They're in Roxbury Memorial, they're in Tech, they're in Trade, they're in Girls Latin, and Boys Latin, they're in English.
Yes.
And they're playing on the playgrounds and getting better at basketball because basketball was invented in Springfield and it grew here, and it's the post-Cousy era, and they just grew up in a basketball-strong ecosystem. Although, again, it's not. There was very strong high school basketball, and the Tech tournament was a big deal in the 60s. But a lot of the schools that would come out of the Tech and win it would be like a Somerville or Belmont, depending on the division, or a Charles So sometimes the Boston schools were getting eliminated in or before the finals by a school like Braintree or somebody like that. But the Boston schools in the early '60s, Ridge had very strong teams, so they wouldn't get eliminated. When Ron Texera goes to Catholic Memorial, he's not going to get eliminated.
Yeah.
Parade All-America 3 years, and he's all scholastic 4 years. So now you're getting these guys, like the Stead brothers over at Range, Ronnie Texera at Catholic Memorial, who are high school All-American, and they're big men.
Yeah.
But we always had guards. So the guards would go to trade, they play at Roxbury Memorial. They wouldn't be on anybody's recruiting radar because they're going to get a job. They're going to work. They're going to trade to work. So what would happen is you'd see a little bit about them in the paper, but we knew about them in the community because we saw them play at the Lewis School,
Yes.
or Washington Street, or whatever Carter Playground. So they were big names to us, but they weren't big names to Duke and Kentucky and Kansas. So we get a smattering of guys, and in the late '60s, some of these guys get picked up and get D1 scholarships, like Russell Lee, Ronnie Lee's older brother.
Yeah.
From Hyde Park, he goes to Marshall, one of the best scorers in Marshall history.
And he's huge in the nation. He's like one of the biggest players in the nation.
Exactly. Marshall Lewis from Tech makes high school All-American '68. So it looks like an anomaly, and the recruiters consider it an anomaly. Every few years, there's like a Jimmy Walker type, not Jimmy Walker, of course, but somebody on the level of national radar. And people think, yeah, that's nice every now and then, but you're not New Haven, Wilbercross, you're not New Haven, Hillhouse.
Yeah.
And for a city this size, it's like the paper is focused on the Sox and hockey, and to some degree the Celts in season, and Northeastern basketball, BU basketball, BC basketball, Holy Cross basketball, because these teams have won like NITs and NCAA tournaments, and the high school is, again, it's a big deal with people.
Yes.
But it's hard, it's not covered by the media like the New York media covered New York high school, or Philly media covered Philly high schools. Yeah. So, radio, TV, print, books about it, lore. It just isn't, because you got the Bruins and the Sox, and the Patriots come in the 1960s.
Yeah. And that's one of the big issues that we run into when we're trying to investigate or do any research on this era of basketball, because if we rely on periodicals, Boston schoolboy basketball, as they called it then, especially in the city league, is really underreported. When we do find articles, it's really tiny, and they're off in a spot in the sports section where we're like, did anybody attend these games? And we can barely find pictures, and when we do, of course, they're black and white. So
it's very it's almost one of those things, to use a cliche, you had to be there.
Yes.
Because if you didn't see these guys running the street, or you didn't see them play under the whistle and regulation, it was like, oh, that's the era of Ted Williams and Carl Yastrzemski and Bobby Orr, which it was, and the expansion and the AFL Patriots, which it was. But underneath the box scores and things like that, there's some really good players coming around in the era of Spider Bennett,
yes,
Jimmy Walker, Harry Barnes, Leo Osgood, that if they were playing in the 80s, D1 recruiters would be camping out the doors.
Yeah. And this is where it brings us to something that's super frustrating. Me, somebody who's poured through box score after box score, as you well know, when you read old box scores, they're not formulated like box scores now, where they tell you how many shots were taken, how many were missed, and other things. It just says how many field goals were made, how many free throws were made, and total number of points. No rebounds, no assists. So, which brings us to a discussion that something that I've racked my brain about. I've talked to several people. They all have different versions of this story. Here we go. Boston's role in the popularization of the crossover. Now, my understanding is that there's a story out there that Sam Jones is the one who recruited Jimmy Walker from trade and got him out of trade and got him into the Longburn Institute. And
Which was Sam's alma mater.
Yes, with Sam alma mater.
As the lore goes.
And also Spider Bennett came along with him. But there's another story that he was being coached and taught specifically by another guy
who was popular at a specific court in Roxbury.
Exactly. I know the guy's name and nickname and everything.
Okay.
Name.
All right. So can we get into that story?
So to give people sort of an analog or a parallel, the Jimmy Walker was discovered by Sam Jones, and Sam sent him to Laurinburg Institute or Laurinburg Prep, which is a segregated black male, actually it's a co-ed in the Earl Manigault HBO film is co-ed. I don't think it was co-ed, but the fact that he sent them to his alma mater
From trade
is sort of the Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5 last night. The Pips sent the Jackson's 5 tape in story, when actually it was Bobby Taylor in Vancouver who saw them on the Chitlin circuit and sent a tape in. But very, well, first of all, sounds better to have Diana Ross discover the Jackson 5. And secondly, Gladys did send a tape in, and Barry had already been hip to them by a guy in that band.
And it took years before they got signed.
And they never used the Bobby Taylor song.
Exactly.
So Sam was obviously hip to Jimmy Walker, because Jimmy Walker was 14, was kind of chubby. He wasn't refined, but he had a lot of really valuable skills in terms of his ball handling ability and his agility, even though he was a little overweight. He was like 14. And the guy who really worked him out on the playgrounds was a guy named Francis Jefferson, who they call Renge Jefferson.
Yes.
Because he went to Renge. He played for Kentucky State, probably in the late 40s. And he would really work with him on his game. And then Jimmy Walker took a lot of time on the Lewis playground when everybody went home after pickup, when it got dark, and worked on his own, on his handle, on spin, on reverse, and things like that. And so the crossover piece is that he goes down to Laurinburg, and obviously he's in a backcourt with 6'6" Charlie Scott and 6'2" Earl Manigault.
Yes.
So the brother who integrates the ACC and the brother who Kareem says is the best player
he ever played in the league. Yes.
These guys on the same prep school team.
Yeah.
Segregated. So they're playing like the freshmen of Fayetteville State and the freshmen of like Elizabeth City State. And they're beating them by, they're beating those teams by double digits.
These are all CIA teams.
Yeah, they're playing freshman teams. And other schools that are like 13th grade academies, private academies, prep academies. Probably the first time that Earl Manigault or Charlie Scott saw a spin move, or somebody go underneath their leg and change the ball to the other hand, was probably Jimmy Walker, not some kid in Harlem or the Bronx or Brooklyn. It was Walker, because they were his teammates.
Yes.
And everyone insists, even Bill Reynolds, who played for Brown in the 60s and played against Walker, wrote, Fall River Dreams and books like that. He insists, and a lot of people insist, that the first person in D1 college ball that they ever saw go from their right hand to the left hand
Charlie
to
Scott
the leg was Jimmy Walker. And that the first person that they saw regularly use a spin dribble, a spin move, was Jimmy Walker. Because Jimmy Walker hadn't seen Earl Monroe.
Okay.
Monroe was at Winston-Salem, so there's no TV.
Yes.
And Monroe's from Philly. So he didn't see Earl Monroe.
Exactly.
So there's that. And then Al Root goes down to the CIAA.
A man who people do not talk about nearly enough.
Al Root from Roxbury Memorial. Same period as Winston Bennett, Spider Bennett, Willis Bennett, Spider Bennett, Sharif Abdul-Rahim's uncle.
Yeah.
Same period as James Walker, about the same age. Al Root goes down to Delaware State, and in the '66 CIAA tournament,
Yes.
he scores the most points in CIAA tournament history. Monroe doesn't hold the record.
Yes.
And Monroe averaged 41 in college.
Yeah.
So Albie Root was under the radar nationally. But he's a Memorial. So the papers are like, Roxbury Memorial, whatever. But if you don't go deep into tech, and a lot of schools, again, from, I'm trying to think of some of the teams, there would be just a lot of cities that the whole city goes to one high school,
Yes.
like Brockton, and they would win the tech.
Yeah.
Because everybody in Brockton is at Brockton High.
And Brockton High is huge. So, another story I heard is that in 1963, a player named Jimmy Walker dominated the Rucker League. And one of the people he faced was Charlie Scott. Is that true?
That is true. So people in New York knew about Walker and saw his moves and things like that while he was still at Laurinburg. And to just bring people up to speed about, well, how does this guy become, a D1 player, lead the nation in scoring? Obviously Jalen Rose's biological father and the #1 overall pick in the NBA draft. Bill Blair, who was a nasty player from Roxbury,
And his cousin,
is being recruited by Dave Gavitt's predecessor, Joe Mulaney.
Yes.
And Bill Blair, Walker's tells Mulaney when he's recruiting Blair, you should see his cousin. And that's what led Jimmy Walker to Providence, averaging 30 in college, 50 in the game, two-time Holiday Festival MVP.
Actually being on television, which is crucial.
Being on TV, well, yeah, some TV exposure, ECAC, and the #1 overall player in the NBA draft. Such a great athlete that he's the only athlete in the history of sport, team sports, to be the #1 overall pick in one sport, and he was the last overall pick in pro football because the Saints, who were expansion team, just took a chance on him. A kid with that kind of reflexes, that kind of balance and agility and vision would have to be a good wide receiver. And we're going to waste the pick anyway, so we might as well waste it on him.
Yeah. So, okay, when we think about Jimmy Walker and what he means to Boston basketball, East Coast basketball, but Boston basketball as a whole, he's the one player that everybody points to and they know. Why? Because he was visible. I can pull up footage of Jimmy Walker doing spin moves, doing the inside hand change, dropping the ball and coming up on the other side, going past somebody, hitting long jumpers.
Throwing blind passes to the weak side with one hand.
Exactly.
Off the dribble.
Yes. These are stories that I'm told people were doing before Jimmy and with Jimmy, but we get to see it, which is something that's completely
valuable
different.
in our society.
Yes. So when we think about Boston basketball and the visibility in players actually getting D1 scholarships, as you mentioned before, a lot of those players that were coming out of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan were playing Division II.
They're playing at segregated schools in the Mid-Atlantic and the South, which is their first experience with Jim Crow. They've never been to segregated restrooms. When they get to D.C. and Union Station, they got to switch trains and get on the Negro section of the train. These guys didn't know anything about that, unless their parents were recent immigrants from the South.
Yes.
So, they're at Delaware State. They're at Morgan. There was a Delaware State pipeline facilitated by a couple of people. One was Reverend Michael Haynes, who was also involved with the Bruins / Norfolk House, the Bruins, the colored Bruins. Various iterations of the Bruins were a great semi-pro team. And obviously, and his brother's Roy Haynes, the drummer,
Exactly.
Sarah Vaughn's drummer. Half-brother. Roscoe Baker's also his half-brother.
This is crazy.
So there's a Delaware State pipeline that Josh Colbert, who was the AD of Delaware State, who I think was an All-American football player at Cornell, like in the 30s or 40s.
Yes.
Jerome Holland, Brett Holland, that's his name,
Yeah.
sorry. He facilitates some of that, but it comes out of Reverend Haynes steering kids to Delaware State. And in that pipeline, the first kid was Huey Joyner, who I think was at Roxbury Memorial in the late 50s. Then it's Al Rue in the early 60s. Winston-Salem State had a little basketball pipeline from here. It's Spider Bennett in the mid-60s. But the first person was Louis Walcott, or Gene Walcott, the hurdler from Boston Latin.
Who is also known as
Mr. Louis Farrakhan.
Yes.
So kids heard about him, and he liked it down there. He was on a track scholarship. And even though he didn't stay because obviously Sister Bessie got pregnant, he drops out of school, and the rest is history because he starts going to the temple.
And then he runs into his fellow Roxbury resident in New York.
Yeah, another West Indian.
Yeah.
Quincy Mountain.
Yes, exactly.
So Walcott is happy down there. Tells the guys about it. Word of mouth in those days. You couldn't look up these schools online.
No.
And your parents didn't know that much about them if your parents hadn't been to college, which a lot of people hadn't. They worked in other people's homes for a living, a lot of people. They were home employees or nurses and things like that. So there's a Winston-Salem pipeline. And the Winston-Salem pipeline, Jeep Jones goes down there after Louis Walcott.
Yes.
So he's a point guard. And as we know, Big House Gaines doesn't just give his offense to anybody and say, you're my quarterback.
Yes.
So he had to be able to play.
Yes.
This guy won 800 games. He's not just going to give you the keys to the to the limo and say, run my offense for me. So Jeep must have been nasty.
Yeah, and there's a Jeep Jones Park, Clarence Jeep Jones Park, for anybody who's wondering. The man is a legend.
So Jeep is in that pipeline, and then Spider Bennett comes along. So these things are not accidental. They're very community, very close, very tight. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody plays on the same playground. It's word of mouth. Back in those days, in the late 50s and early 60s, kids were so tight that everybody knew each other from either the school board parade and or things like all the Boston public high schools trained in track and field at White Stadium at the same time of day under the same coach. Because one high school coach would get to the track, maybe he had a big student body like Tech, and he would train all the kids from the rival schools because everybody had to train at 3:30 anyway, and everybody had to use White wide stadium anyway, so they just used one coach. That's how close knit Boston was.
And that bred a whole lot in terms of so the BNBL again is created in 1969 out of the ashes of the Boston Tech League, and it's the longest running continuous municipal basketball league in the nation. And what happens is, in 1972, I mentioned it before, we have the Roxbury Basketball Association, which is Boston's response to the record. It runs from 1972 to 1987, and there are some names, some names that played in that league. And then, of course, the big thing is the explosion of the Boston Shootout, which gives rise to the Boston Six, which is kind of Boston's
Coming out party.
yes, Boston's coming out party to the rest of the world. So let's talk about that era.
Okay, this is how this came about. Again, very organic. After the great English teams of the late '60s, the team with the chant,
Who rings the bells? Owen Wells.
Who's our bailiff? Tommy Taylor. Who's all around? Twinkie Brown. That team. After that, people are like, there's something going on here. Jimmy Walker is not just some random accident.
He's not an anomaly.
He must have been playing against and with somebody for him to, and Willis Bennett and all these guys, Harry Barnes, Leo Osgood, Ron Texera, Marshall Lewis, Russell Lee, Ronnie Lee. Like, somebody must have whooped up on them when they were 13 or 14 for them to be this good. Let's start finding these kids when they're 14 or 15 years old. So now, there's 71, 72, there's a kid named Stevie Struther.
Yes, struggle.
And he plays at Washington Park and owns the place. He plays for Dorchester. And one day at Washington Park, when there's like Celts lying on the fence watching, all kinds of Tommy Heinz and all kinds of people in there, he basically destroys Charlie Scott during a pickup game. To the point where Charlie Scott, it's more than a pickup game. It's like a summer league game where you have to pay a fee to get in.
Yes.
Like $10. So Charlie Scott gets so frustrated, he kicks the ball over the fence onto Washington Street and goes to his gym bag and gets his $10 out, slaps it out because he knows he's going to be fined for a forfeit.
Yeah.
That's how badly Steve Struther took, the crowd is admonishing him, on the show stroll. And he's just using him. Charlie Scott, the same guy from, Jimmy Walker's prep school team, who was 6'6" guard, All-America.
Who has been given the thing saying that he's the guy who popularized the crossover.
Exactly, and the first prominent black player in the ACC.
Yes.
So that story, Struther is a year before the Boston Six. So there's a gentleman who's working out of Coca-Cola in Western Mass, Pittsburgh, named Ken Hudson, who's the second black NBA ref, and he hears the little buzz about these players here, but he doesn't live here. He's in Western Mass, but he has corporate ties. So he thinks, I wonder what would happen if we got enough of these kids that are coming out next year to put them on a Boston team and bring in teams from other cities, big metropolitan areas like a Connecticut team, a DC team, a New York City team, and test their mettle. It would do two things. It would give us sort of a level of how good these guys really are. Because if we get Connecticut, you're talking about Wilbercross and
Yes.
New Haven Lee and Hillhouse and teams like that. And all the Bridgeport, Bridgeport Central, Bridgeport, Warren Harding, all of those schools.
Yeah, the ones with
Guys that
reputations.
can, Super John Williamson, Super
Yes.
Campbell, and those kind of guys.
Yeah.
Those kind of guys. But I have to talk to my people at Coca-Cola, but then I don't really know anybody in the Bury like that. I don't have anybody in the community to sort of shepherd it for me and be my inroad to the kids. So he had to meet Miss Alfreda.
Oh yeah, Alfred Harris.
Alfreda Harris. He had to engage Roscoe and he had to engage Jeep because they knew who the kids were. And he didn't know this landscape. So what comes out of that is a tournament where you do bring in strong metropolitan cities of all-star teams, kids from much larger cities. Cities 8 million people, 10 million people, LA, New York, eventually LA. Chicago, much bigger city, to face the Boston team. Boston is the host. The early years is at Cabot Gym. But Struther missed that because he graduated in 71.
Yes.
But in 72, you have Carlton Smith at English. You have Ronnie Lee in Lexington. You have King Gastons in Memorial. You have Bobby Carrington. You have the brother That is Bob Carrington. The other Bob is second Bob, and then you have Wilfred Morrison from Boston Tech. And if I'm leaving out somebody, they were called the Boston Six by the newspapers and things like that because they were coming out the same year.
Yes.
And they actually, DC brought Adrian Dantley to the first shootout and some other guys that could really roll. New York brings Phil Sellers, who goes on to the
Phil Sellers.
undefeated Rutgers team.
Yeah.
He's a freshman on there.
Yeah, wow.
They were 31 and up. Mike Dabney, Maya Moore's dad was on
Yeah.
the team. So he's on that before Rutgers. He's on the Brooklyn team. Brooklyn gets upset by DC. But Boston beats Connecticut in the semifinals when Connecticut had Walter Luckett, which averaging 39 and some change a game.
Yeah.
He's from Bridgeport.
Yes.
They beat them. So Boston plays DC in the final with Dantley, and Boston wins the first shootout. Happy with that.
How did they?
There's only 550,000. Boston won the Boston. Adrian Dantley is on the three-time high school All-American. He plays for DeMatha, the UCLA of high school.
Yeah.
They beat them? Like what? Brooklyn isn't even in the final. What's going on?
Yeah. I was hearing that people thought there was a typo in the paper.
It's like these six guys. You better come with them. We don't care who you are because we used to play with Stroh and against these guys like Leo and Harry and Playground. We can play. So
Bring anybody. Yes.
Bring it. In later years, LA, New Orleans, Chicago, a lot of them went home with L's because you got the Shannon Crookses, you got the Penas, you got Monty Man. We can play. You may not associate us with inner city or black people, or schoolyards or what have you, but don't let the TV show Boston Public and The Departed and Mystic River and don't let
that fool
the town.
you.
Don't let that fool you. I mean, there's a reason why the spin move comes out of the Lewis playground.
One of the funniest things I experienced this past summer, as you know, Mike Bivens has a tournament for $20,000, and a team from Atlanta descended upon Roxbury, and their eyes were wide as saucers when they saw the crowd, and they got beaten by a team of Boston guys who were swatting the ball into the third row, crossed them over, had one guy just take over like he was Kemba Walker. I have it on video. And they went home with an L. And I wish you could see their faces when they looked around and saw the crowd.
Matt Damon wasn't on the team. Mark
Wahlberg wasn't on the team.
Ben Affleck wasn't on the squad.
Yeah. What's going on? Yeah, this ain't my idea what Boston is, So,
Pat Ewing helped change that a little bit from the other side.
Yes, he did.
Because Rens started getting the national level. Like, okay, we get it. Freddie Hill, four-time MEAC, all MEAC player from Brookline at Howard. People, okay, we get it. All right, we get the message.
Yeah.
Randall and Wayne.
Exactly. So we've talked about Roxbury Basketball Association filtering to the Boston Shootout and the MIA, which was created in 1972 to kind of have to deal with the fact that now we have talent at the Boston North and South, but we're losing a lot of those teams because something we haven't mentioned yet is post.
The two elephants in the room, Metco and Bussin.
Yes, Metco and Bussin. So 1976 going forward, after the court case came down, and now we're going to consolidate schools. So that means that we're going to take kids out of the traditional schools that they went to in the city, and what busing is that we take kids from one place and send them to another place where they aren't.
Where the schools were just as hard, where Charlestown, Hyde Park, and Southie had 50% dropout rates, just like Roxbury Memorial and Tech.
Exactly.
Because Dr. Ruth Batson famously did this study, which led to the court case.
Yes.
And she said that these three schools have the highest dropout rate in the Irish towns and cities.
Yes.
These three schools have the highest dropout rates in Roxbury and the lowest average college admission percentage for the senior class, the same socioeconomic level.
Yes.
All Garrity did was flip it and send kids to, like, on a bus at 6 o'clock in the morning to go with some kids that they never knew.
Yes.
They weren't in the chess club.
Exactly.
They weren't on the soccer team. They didn't have any friends.
Schools that didn't have hockey teams.
It wasn't like they were sending them to Native High or Wellesley High to get like a better education. That's Metco.
Yes.
This was sports busing. So why would I want to go? Nothing against Southie, but I mean, the white kids don't want to go there. It's
Yes, exactly.
frame it. It's you're sending a kid from one bad school to another bad school where he doesn't know anybody or she doesn't know anybody at 5:30 in the morning, so that the schools will be racially mixed.
Yes, which
Okay.
was going to have issues. Now, my experience with busing was that, of course, I started going to school in 1978. And the first school I went to was shut down and turned into condos. I was told this in kindergarten too, that I was going to another school. That school was already in an area of the South End that was mostly Latino, Black, and Asian because it was next to Chinatown. What they did was they bused white kids from Southie and Eastie to my neighborhood. That's my experience with busing. It was white kids with huge eyes coming off the bus, saying the N word, getting knocked out, and then becoming our best friends, and us all playing basketball and football together, and then them dying and going to jail.
I mean, again, there's a lot of nuance to, the dynamics of these things and even how they inform, like the shape of sports in Boston. But what happens is now you're starting to get these kids, and the media covers them differently, who would be at a Don Bosco.
Exactly.
So Felton Sealy in the mid-70s, he's at Don Bosco, so he goes to Oregon. James Bailey is a Zavarian, so he goes to Rutgers, and he's on that 31-0 team as a freshman.
Yes.
Kids are going to schools, they're going to the Archbishop Williams, they're going to the Natives like Bruno Giles. So they're covered differently because the media was already covering those schools because they have soccer teams, track teams, football teams, and they're the only teams in that city.
Yes.
So if you got a city with, let's say, 80,000 people, and there's one feeder high school for all the junior highs and grad, you're going to have a good most team sports and most,
like Fall River with their
sport.
Yes. As opposed to Boston with 40 schools.
A lot of schools and a lot of talent. So that changes everything because the recruiters are recruiting a kid essentially at either a private school or a suburban school. He doesn't feel like I got to go in the hood and look at some guy because again, pre-internet. So they're not going to English. If English has a great player, they're going to get them. But also people are either transferring out because their mothers and fathers are more savvy, or to the point of Metco, you got these kids that are just going to the place that might have the best basketball.
Yeah.
Like the kid Gary Burke in the late 70s, early 80s. He's at Fitchburg, Notre Dame one year. He's on Cathedral when they go to the States in 76. 77 he's at Ranch.
You said Ranch, Cambridge, Virginia.
Now, you may not know Massachusetts, but Pittsburgh
and
is not in southeastern Mass. And he's all scholastic at all three of these schools in 3 years, such that the Globe did like a big front page, almost like an expose. This kid Gary Burke is like a mercenary, but that was the opportunity that came about because of Metco. And again, forced busing just changed the whole basketball map.
Yeah.
And then it really sort of predates AAU, but what happens is now you're not getting the stronger programs in public schools and hoops like that, because either kids got bussed out, or when people's parents started doing a little better in the early to mid 70s, they actually moved to Milton, they actually moved to Randolph, they moved to Newton, they moved to Natick, they moved to Wellesley, they moved to Framingham. So now the kids are playing for like David Thompson and our David Thompson.
No, not the Chip Thompson.
They're playing for Stoughton.
Yeah.
Probably 5 years before that, they wouldn't have been at Stoughton. They would have been like maybe at English or something like that.
So this changes everything as far as basketball is concerned. But the big thing is that it changes recruiting. So now we're watching television and we're seeing players in the Big East. We're seeing players in the ACC. We're seeing players in the Big Ten, which were recruited by schools that actually get recruiting, as opposed to digging through the hood, watching BABC games, trying to find the kids who actually get into AAU and find somebody like a Leo who actually goes in the hood and does the work for them. And this changes the game entirely. So when
It doesn't change the summers.
No.
It's still always the Titans, Brodsky. It's always the same.
The South End Squires.
Always the same strong summer. The kids always know each other.
Yes.
Whether it's Jimmy Walker's era with Spider Bennett and those guys, and Range is working with them, and Sam Jones is working those guys out. Whether it's the late 60s guys and Harry and Leo are whooping up on kids, and those kids come up and become great players like Ronnie Lee. Whether it's the mid 70s with the Jam and James Baileys, the Felton Sealeys, the Paul Littles, and they're
Paul Little out of Boston Latin.
They're working out people, and those kids become better because if you're 13 and 14, you're really good. They'll let you play with them.
Yes.
Like people let Dana and Ramil play with them when they were young. they always knew who each other were. It's just that there's so many different options in terms of where to go to school.
Yeah.
By the time those people come around, the Butch Wade era.
Oh. Who went to Michigan?
To Michigan, it was D1. 10 or 11 years before that, a kid from his high school, I think he went to, not East, Butch Wade went to, yeah, he did go to East. They Michigan, because Michigan would be recruiting a kid at a school that has good swimming, good track and field, good basketball, good football, a big, well-funded school.
Yeah, and like a lot of things happen in Boston, and a lot of y'all who aren't from Boston don't understand. Like one of the big things that happened was when Boston United moved out of the Boston City League to the Dual County League, and that changed recruiting. So Paul Little gets recruited more because he's not dealing with Boston South or North. He's coming out of the DCL, which is the Dual County League. Yes. Parker Carlisle. Yeah. And
Playing against kids, in most cases, a lot of those kids whose parents had, a couple dollars.
yeah. So now when we come up to post 1979, 1980, we kind of start with who else? Patrick Ewing. And Patrick Ewing was a freshman. CRLS had a completely different uniform. They had a different coach.
They were kind of low budget.
Yes, black and white uniforms.
They didn't even merge those schools to become the one school until I think the 60s.
Yeah.
So there used to be like Range Tech, which was a basketball power. They had these big 6'6", 6'7" guys, the Stead brothers, who went on to play at like Villanova and places like that. They had DJ Jarvis, Richie Jarvis. They had Mike Jarvis.
The Mike Jarvis.
Pat's coach and the GW coach and St. John's coach. So they were a power when the school was just called Range Tech. They merged with Cambridge Latin, and then they became a bigger school. And Pat immigrates here when he's 14.
Yes.
And they get this gift on Mike Jarvis's lap. But they were nice before that. They had Paul Little in the mid-70s. I told you Gary Burke did one of his obligatory stints there. But they were high school sports. The first person ever jumped 7 foot in the high jump, John Thomas, at the range.
Yes.
They were sports power.
And from there, they get a national reputation. And you see Patrick Ewing everywhere. And from then, there's a light shined in Boston on their basketball again since 1972, which was crazy because the biggest stories I remember as a kid was Larry Bird just showed up on the Celtics, and there's this kid, Patrick Ewing, at Cambridge Ranger Lab.
Yeah. When Ewing was a freshman and sophomore, especially sophomore, he was on TV about something or other every week. If he wasn't on Bob Lovel's show, Jimmy Myers was talking about it. Sometimes he was on Black News. They covered that kid, even in the offseason, every week. Because this 6'11" kid that everybody, back then, nobody was going to go unless you were Moses or Bill Willie or Darryl Dark. They knew that the kid was going to go to college somewhere. You're not going to go straight to the pros.
No.
Because he was sort of he was a work in progress. So Boston was fascinated, like, we just got this 6'11" kid dropped in our lap. We played him 4 shootouts. They never won a shootout.
No.
Played him 4 shootouts. So now he's being recruited to the level like a Ralph Sampson.
To the point where he got called in to work out for the national team before the Olympics when he was, in the 11th grade?
The Pan Am Games or something.
Yes, the Pan Am Games and the Olympics.
Yeah, so that team is in the national media. They would be like a Dunbar or Baltimore in the sense that people cover them because now you have USA Today and there's national rankings and we can start to quantify these teams and things. And they play people from other states.
Yes.
So you could say, well, how would they do against Wilbercross? Because they played Wilbercross. They got destroyed, but
Yeah. So like now we're coming through the era of the 80s where people are showing up not just in the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, but the Sunday edition of Parade. They're showing up in Street and Smiths, Athletic Sports, all these scholastic magazines. They're appearing, and you're seeing teams from Massachusetts in them with these known players. So this is the explosion of the 80s, which lends to us when we start doing the throwback uniforms. So, could we talk about that era, especially like the explosion of college basketball with the expansion of cable and the Big East? Dave Gavitt changes everything.
Yeah, when you have Providence or BC,
Yes.
on TV every Monday, and you're a kid from Eastern Mass, and you see, these older guys like Mike Harris on TV. It's different because now it's like, and even like the Yankee Conference with URI and the strong players that were, the UNH and BU, you're seeing these people who are now testing their mettle in regulation games against the best kids Harlem and Brooklyn and the Bronx have to offer, like Pearl Washington.
Yes.
And they're taking games off people like that. The John Bagneys and Michael, they're taking games off people like that. And a lot of these are New England kids. Bagney and Adams are New England kids. Tommy Garrick is a New England kid from Rhode Island.
Yes.
So what that does is now kids want to play for a Gary Williams at BC, or they want to play for a Rick Pitino at BU, because at least you're on television and sometimes national. So now you want to say, well, where do I want to go to high school? I want to go to a high school that's going to be a pipeline to like a Big East level or exposure level school, and most of those schools were close to home.
Yes. So one of the things I remember as a kid was seeing guys like, of course, Patrick Ewing. It was a big deal when Patrick Ewing decided to go to Georgetown over BC. It was a huge deal. But seeing guys like Dana Barrows go to BC to replace a John Bagley and succeed, living in a place where we have in our backyard playing, we have a guy from Baltimore named Reggie Lewis, and he plays against some kid from New York who ends up being the father of this guy who played for the Celtics who left, Dredrick Irving, and him
Who could play?
who hung around the city and played with these young guys in all these different courts. That changed the way we looked at basketball.
It changed the way Kyrie looked at basketball when he thought about coming here and playing pro, because his dad had regaled him with all these tales of playing against this person in the street, that person in the street. So he grew up knowing about this stuff.
In 1988-89, his dad won a championship in this local league with a team called the Decepticons. And I remember hearing stories about them. And then, of course, there's like the small semi-pro summer leagues that people played in.
All the kids from like Assumption and Bentley and all the kids, from the smaller schools that could really go. They played in the summer, and then by the early to mid '80s, after the whole Pat recruiting piece,
Yes.
Dana Barrows and Ramil grew up watching Pat attract, be like this, energy source that attracts all this national pub, even in print, TV, to Boston. So now guys know if I sharpen my game, which was not the case for Leo Osgood or Harry Barnes,
They
if
have
I
the opportunity.
really work and go to Reds camp and go here and do that and lift weights and go to Rainy D's camp and get on a good 16 and under team that goes around the country.
And also, Leo will find us and put us on
Yeah,
the ABC.
I know I'm going to get seen now, and I'm getting, and the local press is covering everybody differently after Pat.
Yes.
It's not just the Pats and the Sox and the Bruins and the colleges and track and field and the marathon, and it's like the city that produced Patrick. Now we got to talk about school football in a different way.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is that there's a year, I can't remember exactly what year it is, where before BNBL scores didn't really show up in the paper, but there was a year where all of a sudden there's a specific section where every single region of the BNBL is covered. And when it gets to the championships, we'll see it in the paper. If not, we'll see it in the local paper, like the South End News. So, that changes everything as far as sport.
And winning the shootout also changes everything, because the year that they win, it's a validating source to the kids that are like 11, 12, 13.
Yeah.
I mean, we beat
Yeah.
New Orleans, Chicago, LA. Yeah. Tracy Murray, we beat Tracy Murray. It's like, the kids are like, okay, I got an older brother or whatever, older sister, what have you. I can really do something with this thing. I'm not going to be, considered this, you're not New York, you're not Philly, you're not DC, you're not Baltimore, that. After Pat went to 3 national championships and came within 5 points of winning 3 rings in 3 years,
Yeah. It changes the conversation, especially when somebody like Dana Barrows beats New York almost almost single-handedly. And all those guys from New York have to go home and explain that they lost to a bunch of guys from Boston. Yeah, yeah. So, you wrote a book that I, as somebody who knows basketball somewhat, I'm not as knowledgeable as some people are, and I defer to them. You wrote a book about Massachusetts basketball and the Boston Vineyards and the islands, and how it affected, basketball as a whole and basketball in the region. Was it called? What was it about?
Martha's Vineyard Basketball is a book that surprises a lot of people just in its very title.
Yes.
Martha's Vineyard is a place where everybody has money, everybody is there physically, their body is there on vacation.
Yes.
It's not the case right now because vacation season is over.
Yes.
There are actually 15,000 people that live there year round. But in the mid-'70s, there was only 7,000 people that lived there year round, right before Jaws was filmed here in '74. So what happens is, because basketball was invented in Springfield, it largely grew in this state to Connecticut and New York from this state in YMCA's, because obviously it's invented by a Y director.
Yes.
And so this state got all the early good teaching and clinicians and girls teams, and Smith College. Cinda Berenson was the woman that was sort of like the Johnny Appleseed of the women's game, was at Smith. And the residue of that is that most kids grow up versed in the game. I mean, there might have been Bobby Orrinks and all this hockey craze, but because of Cousy and because of the 11 rings, people know that there's something going on, even on the Cape and the Islands. And Naismith actually invented the sport 6 months after he had attended a summer, sort of like a phys ed camp or institute on the Vineyard. So he goes to this summer camp in 1891. You learn all these things, these seminars and workshops that will benefit you in teaching phys ed. Different calisthenics and things like that, different things that people are finding effective, best practices around the country. And he's tasked with inventing a new sport as a bridge between the weather in which you can play football and the warm weather that comes back to Springfield when you can play baseball. It's an indoor sport, ideally.
Yeah.
And that's when he invents basketball, 6 months after that Vineyard Summer Institute.
Wow.
So the Vineyard has had high school teams since like the early 1900s, before 1910 aughts, whatever you want to call that decade.
The explosion of football in college.
Mm-hmm. And then, because again, these kids who are the sons and daughters or grandchildren of people who used to work for well-to-do Boston families on the Cape and the Islands.
Yeah.
The long and short of it is, the people who were like the laundresses and the hairdressers and hairstylists and chauffeurs for well-to-do Boston families on the Vineyard would save up their money in the 20s and 30s and 40s and buy the guest cottage that they used to live in as household staff.
Wow.
And the guest cottages, when they bought them, they would take their kids there in the 50s and 60s. And then the people would be like the mother or son of those people, the people that were household staff, owned those houses by the 60s and the 70s. So a lot of kids from like Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, or even because there was more school integration than kids from the suburbs, would go there in the summer. And in 1970, there was a summer league formed there. And it was a pretty strong one, because not only did you have those kids whose parents were from Greater Boston who summered there, but you also had kids from Brooklyn and Harlem and Newark and Queens and Philly whose parents summered there. And because it's such a very small place, and Oak Bluff specifically is small, everybody during the baby boom came down to those courts to either play in the games in the morning. Well, in the morning, you could play in a league. Like if you were 9 to 11, you played in one league, 11 to 13 in another one. It's called the ABA. If you were 13 to 15, you played in one called semi-pro. And if you were like a high school kid or a college kid, where you could really play, like a person out of school, you would play at night in something that they called the NBA. Springfield, Providence, what have you. And those guys would run at night. So you've been to that court 3 times. That court consumed your entire day.
Yes.
If you didn't play when you were too old to play or too young to play, or before they had girls integrate onto the boys' teams like around 74, you would watch because your brother or your cousin or your sister was down there playing. So between watching, playing, or local vineyard kids who also played down there, who also got better, because in the summer they're playing against kids from Harlem and the Bronx and Roxbury and Mattapan and Newark and Philly and DC. They're getting better. So by the time, I say by the early 70s, the vineyard has a high school team which has a kid who moved from Newark after the Newark riots. Wow. Because the parents wanted to live in a safer environment. They had a kid from DC who transferred from DC. Well, here's the story. Dr. King gets killed.
Yes.
His parents come to the vineyard on their summer vacation as a routine in '68, and they just never moved back to Washington. He had just been, he was a ninth grader, and he was a strong CYO player in DC. His name was Amari Bannister.
Oh, yeah.
And Morgan Wooten offered him a scholarship to DeMatha the same year he offered one to Adrian Dantley.
Wow.
So he would have been at DeMatha 69 to 72. But after the riots, he moved to the vineyard. So the vineyard has Amari Bannister, who's from DC, Ralph Robinson, who's really from Newark,
Yeah.
and then good vineyard kids who are playing against kids from all over the Eastern Seaboard in the summertime. So they're not afraid of anybody.
Yes.
So by 72 and 73, the vineyard has like a 22-1 team and a 23-1 team. They're going like 3 or 4 rounds into the state for the high school with 400 people.
Yeah.
They played in 76. They went to the States and they went to the South Sectional, and because of the size of the school, they played Cathedral. When Cathedral had Mimi James and Gary Burke and DeJuan Chandler, the vineyard was beating them 22-19 in the first quarter.
They were beating a team with one man on it.
They were beating them, and the vineyard was only behind 31-30 at the half. This is a true story. The coach of Martha's Vineyard Regional High, Jay Schofield, tells everybody this. He said, when we're walking through the tunnel to go to the locker room in the garden, he said, I heard one of the kids from Cathedral say, man, those kids can play. They're only behind by 1 at the half. And the reason is, Lily Pope from Brighton High, who plays for the Titans, summered on the vineyard. So they've already seen guys like this all the time. And there's not that many kids faster than Lily Pope.
Yeah.
So you figure if you got to guard him, DeJuan Chandler, I'll do the best I can with DeJuan Chandler. Now, in the fourth quarter, size and depth overpowered them, and they didn't win the game. But that just gives you a sense of how, when you've played with people from all over the country, kids used to come from Howard and Hampton.
Yes.
On the reputation of a vineyard kid whose parents had a summer home there, would tell them that there was good pickup ball there. So he would bring some of his boys from either Howard or Hampton. They would be like, I'm going to beat some rich kid. They ain't going to beat Ted Kennedy. There's not going to be no ball. And the kids would come from Howard and Hampton and play pickup. They couldn't even get in the games.
Yes.
So that's that tradition. And the girls actually won the state in 79 and 81. Again, because size of school, they're playing like Cathedral. They're playing like schools like Michelle Edwards' high school or Robin Christian's high school and beating them.
Wow.
And the other thing is these kids have been playing together since they were grammar school.
That's the key.
So they don't have
the
to
key
look at
thing.
each other when they pass.
Yes, that's a key thing.
Yeah, they've been playing together since they were in grammar school and they play together all summer.
Yeah.
So the telepathy on the court, you can't.
Yeah, and I can't stress this enough. Boston Titans, huge team in this region, fielded legendary players, great coaches, greater people. And Michelle Edwards is a Boston legend herself. Grew up around the neighborhood, played overseas, was great in the NCAA. Ended up playing.
Vivian Stringers.
Yes.
It's just not. It's
Yeah, see
just
Vivian
not
Stringer.
on anybody's door.
Yeah, see Vivian Stringer isn't going to go to someone's home and recruit them just anywhere.
She and Robin Christian.
Yes, and she actually played in. She came back home and played in the ABL. Then she came to the WNBA, played for the Cleveland Rockers. So yeah, I could talk about Ava Roberts.
And
Her,
then
a whole bunch of
all
people.
the kids that come out of the Cooper Community Center that played for them.
Yes.
All the girls. Roxbury Community College girls team used to go to national championships and do work.
Yes. The Cooper Comets, also another regional staple. And the RCC, oh God, RCC fielded some of the greatest men and women's teams of the 80s through the 90s through the zeros. And that's something we have to talk about at some point. So,
Yeah, there's so many so much talent that there's going to be some D2, some D3. There's going to be some kids at Suffolk. There's going to be some kids at UMass. I mean, UMass Boston is a nice sized school, but even when it was Boston State, they're going to get some of these kids because by the late 70s and early 80s, to your point, if you're in the dual county and you could really play, you were going to get some type of college scholarship.
And Boston State had some powerhouse teams playing in D3 and the small New England College Division III, small New England College division. They won a lot of championships. Charlie Titus was there. I believe who was the coach? Who was a former Celtic.
Oh yeah, they had Jonathan Luskatov.
Yeah, so Lusky was their coach. They won a lot.
Assumption looked up on a lot of people in the D3 championship. Bentley was killing me.
If you go back, again I do nothing but research. So if you go back and you research the best teams in the region, Bentley will show up on every single poll at the top. Bentley. They're the 1, 2, or 3. And you'll see Boston State College. You'll see Assumption.
AIC used to
AIC out of Springfield.
Jimmy Calhoun. They were destroyed.
AIC out of Springfield. And of course, we have the Boston universities and Boston colleges who, got some.
Northeastern would get some of the kids. But Northeastern would mostly get kids from, from the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah.
Perry Moss played on the going back to the Vineyard, Perry Moss played pickup and a little bit of summer league there. I played with David Wesley over there, a little bit of pickup. Todd Day used to come over and
Todd Day.
yeah, let's not talk about
Todd
next to the C's.
Oh, Jesus Christ, Todd Day.
Yeah, I got a whiff of why he was like that even when he was just shooting around. I was like, this guy's
Everybody has their Todd Day story.
I got one there.
Between 91 and 93, I can't run into anybody who played basketball in the city. I was 16 and 18 who doesn't have their Todd Day stories.
We played with
Brian Oliver. He didn't stay long in Boston, but I got some Brian Oliver stories too.
The week that Kyrie signed with the Cavaliers,
Yes.
4th of July weekend, he was playing pickup ball in the venue.
Yeah.
When he learned that he was a Cavalier, because his dad told him about this region.
Yeah. So, is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to touch on?
There's just some traditions. We talked about pipelines.
Yes.
But there's some traditions, and I have some theories. You'll have some theories.
Yes.
Everybody's gonna have some theories as to how these traditions became so strong.
Okay.
We've always had good small players that can run offense and can really handle the ball.
Yes.
It goes down through the pipeline. It started with like the Jerry Shaws and the Roscoe Bakers and the
Jeep Jones.
and then it comes through the Walker's handling and control of the ball is just tremendous. Because people are trying to emulate these guys through the Danas and the Ramils, down through the Montes, whatever you think of Montes handle with the Pina and guys like that.
Yeah.
And even up in the suburbs like the Shannon Crookses, they when they would get in a game against national high school,
Like a Jamal Kamal or Anthony, who
they
Anthony
can
was
just
just
go to
all.
the basket at will.
Yeah. Like no one can stop him.
Blaylock, Shabbat, they can just go to the
Shabazz.
basket at will.
Nobody's stopping them guys going to the ball.
Because after Cousy and some other people, that became like a local pride thing. And you've talked about it all.
Yes.
If you couldn't dribble, it's almost like Harlem. Like if you can't dribble, people then you must have literally probably never picked up a basketball because everybody can dribble.
Yes. So I tell stories, and one of my formative years coming up, I grew up around New Edition, and those guys played nothing but basketball. Growing up in the South End Lower Roxbury, it's basketball all the time. And one of the guys was Mike Bibbins, who got on me as a kid because I couldn't go between my legs. He was like, nah, come on, man, you're going to be tall. Come on. How you going to play ball? You can't go between your legs. You ain't got no... Dude, all you got to just drop the ball and catch it. Drop it and catch it. You don't have to push the ball. So basketball, especially dribbling, was crucial because that's how you did anything.
That's how you got playing time if you were younger than the older
Yes.
guys. They would let you play. If you
The short kid who can handle the ball and go up and down the court.
With the bigger.
So again, another thing, sticking point, passing the ball. In Boston, I don't know about other regions, but there's this thing called being a Hun. And if you were a black hole, if you held the ball, you could get beaten up and stabbed and hurt badly. So ball movement was crucial in this region.
Yeah, it is. And when people watch a game and you're watching a game with somebody from Southeastern Mass, like a pro game on TV,
Yes.
the criticism of what's not going on the weak side, who's not moving,
Why are you standing there?
It's like DNA in Southeastern Mass. It could be a 5-year-old girl on a travel team.
Mhm.
She'll be like, go on top of the sprint. The IQ here.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Cousy. It's just unreal with kids that really didn't play high level ball. I mean, but they played in the street and
Yeah.
their uncles and their father. They just know ball. Girls know ball. Everybody just knows ball.
I was 8 years old the first time a girl yelled at me because I didn't set a screen.
You have to, in some cities, if you're physical, or again you have a decent handle, or you can really shoot. If you're a little bit underage of the average player on that pickup court near your house, that's the hottest court, you can get some burn.
Yes.
In Boston and in New Bedford and Fall River, all these working class, Lynn and Lowell and all these towns that have produced all these players over the years, you have to be doing other things when you're not shooting that show that you know the game. If you're not like sitting, you have to be able to play.
Yeah. The way I was able to stay on the court, playing with some high-level talent, and a lot of the people that I played with and grew up with and knew, and the reason why I can have conversations with a lot of these guys, because they recognize me from being the guy who was always on the court, is because I did everything possible to help the team win, even if I wasn't scoring. I was rebounding, I was screening off, I was taking charges, I was blocking shots, I was playing.
Because Channel 38,
Yes.
they're shouting that stuff out. Heinsohn is shouting that stuff. So when you're a little kid, you see that they're shouting out little things that DJ is doing.
Yes.
Little things that ML Carter did. They're not lighting it up.
And they're replaying it. And they're showing, okay.
And even the guys that are lighting it up, like Bird, there's subtle things that he's doing that you're seeing on replay as you're growing up, like, oh,
The ball fake.
You can make a man do that if you do this.
Yes. His ball fake, him looking somebody off, him holding the ball like this while he's still driving.
His pump fake is like a jumper.
Yes, exactly.
His pump fake is a jumper. You can't tell that he's not going to do this.
Yes. One of the crucial things, one of the most important things I remember as a kid, I've talked about this online. When Dennis Johnson cut to the hoop after Larry Bird stole the ball, it's almost like he anticipated Larry was going to steal the ball. So he's cutting to the hoop. And as he's cutting to the hoop, Larry throws him the pass. As DJ's cutting to the hoop, he notices there's a trailer. There's somebody who could possibly block the shot. So rather than lay up at the front of the rim, what does Dennis Johnson do? He does a reverse layup off the glass. So if he does hit it, it's off the glass and it's going to be a goaltending. So, and then after the ball goes in, Dennis Johnson starts defending the man taking out the ball, and he doesn't stop until they call the timeout. I saw that when I was 10 or 11 years old. And that informed everything I needed to know about how to play basketball. Not just watching, and there were other kids who would go, they'd see Dr. J, they'd see Michael Jordan, and they would try to do impossible layups that he did.
And the kids didn't have big hands.
Yes. I was like, one, you can't palm the ball. Two, you're not 6'6". Three, you don't have 44 to 48-inch vertical leap. So what you're doing,
you're working on something that you're not going to be able to.
Yes. But what I could do is I could practice a reverse layup. So, like, these are things that we learned that are in our DNA as young kids growing up.
Older brothers.
Yep. You know?
Aaron learning all that from Mike Aaron.
Yes.
And his older brothers.
Having older guys from the 50s and 60s who actually played yell at you about what you're doing wrong on the court. How you're out of position.
For every Wayne, there's a brother like Tiny.
Yes.
So, people have siblings. The Jarvises were siblings. The Dottons over in Cambridge, all siblings.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't even have a decent conversation at the dinner table. You don't become respectable because they're going to be capping on you like, because you're the little brother, you got to get at least good.
Yeah, you have no left hand.
and out of that comes, you get so good playing with them that when you go play against somebody else, you're like, oh, he ain't even as good as my brothers.
Yeah.
Or my sister. So,
yeah. In many cases in this region, it's your sister. Yep. So, I feel like we touched on pretty much everything. I'm glad to finally have you here to talk about so many things and provide so much like context and back history about Boston, Massachusetts basketball and how we got to where we are here.
And I really appreciate it because it is appreciated as a hotbed now, but to some of the things that we touched on, the ways in which these things things happen, whether they were organic, accidental, happenstance, family relations. It's much more interesting to explore it in the layers or the nuance than it is to be like, oh, and then there was these 6 guys in '72, and then there was this seven footer that came out in '81. There's a whole bunch of social dynamic of who was living where and who could afford to do what and who could transfer, who was from the West Indies. There's a lot of families that are both.
Yes.
They're like West Indian immigrant marries Southern immigrant. That's not common in other, like Howard Bryant, I'm just using him for example, the sports writer. One side of his family is Barbados, and the other side is an immigrant from the South.
In my instance, my father is from Honduras, Central America. My mother is from the South, Alabama, Montgomery County. And what happens? Everybody comes to Boston and they're in Roxbury, and we're next to everybody else.
Every food, every music,
Yeah.
Latin this, Calypso, reggae.
Growing up listening to Soco and Calypso on WILD.
Heavy Dominican population now, so it's a lot of exposure. And the other thing is, when you have 60 colleges within like a 15-mile radius, it's just an educated and curious and intellectual and inquisitive ecosystem to grow up in.
Yes.
The Christian Science Life, the headquarters for this, all the religions and Reverend Ike,
Yes.
Dr. King, all the great ministers who first ministered here, from Malcolm to Dr. King to James Farmer
To the Honorable Louis Farrakhan.
on and on and on. Howard Thurman was at
Yes.
BU. So your grandmothers and your aunts and your mothers were all listening to these guys, sermonize, and that, has some. Where you are really has a profound. No matter what you're going to do, has an effect on you because people are coming to you. They're coming to Harvard, BU, Boston College. You're not going out. There's no internet. You're not going to them. They're coming to you because it's supposedly the cradle of liberty, the cradle of freedom. So Boston is sort of a magnet that brings an inordinate education where, I know like there's a lot of people from Eastern Mass that have a very good grasp of American history because they took Massachusetts history in school.
Yeah.
And you had to pass Massachusetts history to get out of school. Massachusetts is a very old state.
Yeah.
So if you know Massachusetts history, you might know a little bit more about the colonial era than a kid who had to take New Mexico
It's
history.
a perfect example. There's an Apple TV show right now called Dickinson, and I'm watching it, and I can pick out what's inaccurate in the history, and it's not because I studied Emily Dickinson. It's because I'm from Massachusetts and Boston.
Boston's from Lowell.
Yeah. So I'm like, no, they didn't meet yet. No, that didn't happen yet. She wasn't there when he died. How do I know this? Because I grew up here.
The oldest everything.
Yes.
Oldest subway, oldest
Yeah.
everything. Oldest GE engine is from land.
I went to the oldest oldest school in Boston, in America, and then the oldest public school in America.
And Girls Night is the oldest girls. So it's not like a bragging rights thing or a New York, we're not saying anybody can't play, Philly's not this, DC's not that. It's just that this is a hub of like everything,
Yes.
and everything was invented here. If you
The
Google
chocolate
it,
chip cookie was invented here.
Boston people, everything was invented here. Waitresses.
Yes. The steakhouse and the seafood restaurant was invented here. The toothpick was invented here.
Public TV was invented here. Public schools were invented here.
Yeah.
Public libraries. We're sitting in a public libraries were invented here.
This is the most modern library in America.
Basketball was invented in this state.
Yeah.
The first pro dynasty was in this state. The first black,
Refrigeration.
the first black pro player was in the Merrimack Valley, Buddy Lou.
Yes,
So it's not hyperbole. It's just for a small area, for a small region, per capita, it has produced a lot of great players, especially guards because of the IQ. And if you learn the reasons, it's very interesting because it's not the same reasons that Philly has a strong game.
Yes, or
New
Chicago.
York has a strong game, or Chicago being like Alabama and Mississippi migrant, or Detroit being Alabamians.
Yes.
It's a different piece, and that's all it is. It's not better; it's just different.
It's just what
But
it
it
is.
is better.
All right. So glad to have you on, John Bain, a Boston legend.